Horror is a difficult genre. As I've said before, there's a delicate balance that goes into creating a great horror game. Dead Space exemplified this, a great thick atmosphere that flowed through the entire game, intense moments of anxiety and fear. Top it all off with a host of new features that revolutionized the genre and gaming as a whole. Dead Space 2, its sequel, had its work cut out for it. It had to follow a fantastic entry into the annals of horror history. The big question was whether it could improve on those innovations, if it could find ways to deepen the atmosphere and storytelling that the first game introduced. It was a big task, and in some ways Dead Space 2 succeeded, and in other ways it failed. It really improved on the storytelling of the first game, much better pacing, writing, and just a meatier tale overall. But it shifted tone quite a bit, focusing a lot more on the action elements of the game rather than the horror. Today, I'll be taking a look at Dead Space 2, talking about gameplay, mechanics, story, and everything in between. If you haven't seen my previous video on Dead Space, it would be a good idea to check that out before watching this one. If you want to support the channel, you can do so for free by liking this video and subscribing. You can also support me over on Patreon, where I upload text post updates and longer versions of my full retrospectives. If you'd like to see me play other games that I'm not currently reviewing, you can follow me on Twitch. All of those links are down in the description. Spoilers for everything Dead Space 2. Hey Dad, it's me, your favorite son, and today I want to talk about Dead Space 2. Dead Space 2 began its production almost immediately after the release of the first game. It was developed by Visceral Games, which was a rebranding of the original developers, EA Redwood Shores. It was again published by Electronic Arts. A year after Dead Space's release, Glenn Schofield, the creator and executive producer of the original game, left Visceral to start his own company with Michael Condrey, the director of Dead Space. They founded Sledgehammer Games and haven't looked back since. The team working on Dead Space 2 weren't worried, though. Executive producer Steve Papoudis said that it takes a lot more than two people to make a great game. The team's goal with the sequel was to create an improved version of the first game. They wanted to make it accessible to a wider audience and introduce some quality of life improvements to the series. They also wanted to introduce more action to the game. This decision was also influenced by new staff at Visceral and new creative decision makers. In this entry, the team also wanted to focus on the story a bit more. They decided to give Isaac a voice to make him more sympathetic to the audience. The art designer from the first game, Ian Milheim, returned. He was inspired by Gothic architecture to create the Unitologists' Cathedral in the game. This was meant to evoke and communicate the beliefs of the religions and also its worship of the marker itself. The character designs were influenced by the new area introduced, the Sprawl. This was a cityscape in space. Because of this, the new enemy designs reflected people turned in this area, creating many new types of necromorphs. The sound team again used real-world sounds that they would distort and incorporate into the game. They wanted to really focus and hone in on the sound design, improving it beyond the first game. Andrew Boyd, the chief audio director, noted the importance of sound design in horror, making it a point to balance this element for the game's horror component. Dead Space 2 was officially announced on December 7th, 2009. The game was shown off at E3 and a demo was showcased at Gamescom. EA really went all out on the marketing for the game, spending a total of $60 million on spreading the word of Dead Space 2. Dead Space 2 was released in North America for the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and Windows on January 25th, 2011. As always, a note before we get into things. In the previous video, I talked about the real story of Dead Space at the end of the video. This was due to the fact that a lot of the audio logs and text memos we find in the game will give us background information on the situation at hand. This information isn't necessary to the overall plot, but it does help us understand what led to this situation. Now, I won't be doing this for Dead Space 2. The reason is that a lot of the audio logs focus on smaller stories and just sort of fleshing out the attacks by the necromorphs. The other reason is that there's a lot of other media that explains what happens in between Dead Space 1 and 2, so I'll be covering this topic more extensively in the full retrospective. Here, I'm specifically referring to Dead Space Aftermath and Dead Space Salvage, an animated film and a graphic novel, respectively. I do also plan to cover the entire timeline and tie things up in the full retrospective once we get there. Before we actually start the game, I thought it important to note that in the menus there is a previously on Dead Space option, which gives us a little cinematic, recounting the events of Dead Space 1. Most of it's stuff we already know, but it does throw in some interesting background, particularly the point that humanity fled Earth in the 25th century because they ran out of resources. This was how the Planet Cracker ships were created, and the Ishimura was the first. Dead Space 2 starts with a video call between Nicole and Isaac, clearly before her death. She's telling her then-boyfriend about how much she loves her job aboard the Ishimura, but they're cut off. We pan out and Isaac is in some sort of interview. He's being questioned about his nightmares. He sees visions of Nicole beyond the desk. The man at the desk asks Isaac about the marker and what happened on the Ishimura, but Isaac can't answer these questions easily. He's clearly still suffering from hallucinations and delusions from the events of the first game. Some combination between PTSD from the event and the marker's influence still sticking in his mind. The sequence ends when Nicole jumps on the table and her face begins to glow. Dead Space 2 puts a much larger focus on the story. It definitely leans into the cinematic a lot more, and I honestly think it's one of the sequel's greatest strengths. It provides a much more cohesive narrative, improving on the little that there was to criticize with the first game. The visuals that are used to represent Isaac's visions are always great as well. There are these visceral, primordial, alien images, especially in reference to Nicole's light face. Isaac is woken up by someone named Franco. We're in a straitjacket, being rescued with little to no information. Franco is killed before we can get any more, turned into a necromorph in front of our eyes. We're connected to a woman who tells us to get the hell out of there, as we're chased down the halls by various necromorphs. We're in a straitjacket, so we can't fight back. This is a great design choice from a horror perspective. Disabling us and forcing us to get out as fast as possible increases the anxiety right from the beginning. We walk through the facilities, seeing the remnants of what the necromorphs have done in another room. We can see a man being interrogated on a monitor by the same guy who was interrogating Isaac. The man being pestered is named Nolan Strauss, and he's talking about the marker, how it was speaking to him. In the next room, we see the interrogator, who tries to slice Isaac's neck, but instead takes his binds off. He then puts the knife to his own neck. We gain a flashlight, which will be incredibly important in this entry. We get a video call from the woman before. Her name is Dana. She's trying to help us and tells Isaac that he has dementia from what happened on Aegis 7. She can cure him, but we have to get to her. We travel through some service ducts, and Dana tells us that we have to follow her path, because if Tideman finds us, we're dead, whoever that is. We find a man suspended above a table, but we hack the machine. From this, we gain the Kinesis module. This works very similar to Dead Space 1. We can lift objects and throw them, or just move them. Dead Space 2 places a much larger emphasis on using it in combat, though. There are poles placed around almost every room that we can fire at enemies as projectiles. This also gives us a backup option when we run out of ammo and are in a jam. We destroy some necromorphs with it and head into the next area. There, a man has a surgical laser on him and we have to deactivate it. We can't do it quickly enough to save him from the attacking necromorph, though. Either way, we get a plasma cutter from it, our first weapon of the game. It functions just like the last one, letting us dismember enemies with ease. Dead Space 2 uses the same system as its predecessor. Targeting limbs and cutting apart enemies will do much more damage and disable them. We eventually encounter Strauss in person, the man we saw interrogated before. He says he's patient 5 and asks if we remember him before being separated by some blast doors. We're accosted by waves of necromorphs, and Isaac fends them off. Dana tells us that they don't have to be friends, but she can help, and the two can work against Tiedemann. She says that we're on the Titan space station orbiting Saturn. She can't tell us any more though because her signal gets jammed. We hack another panel and get the stasis ability, again very similar to the previous one. Stasis is another ability that's much more encouraged for combat use in this entry. It will slow enemies down, freezing them in time for a brief period. Most enemies in the game move much faster than before. Stasis is almost always necessary in combat, and it's incredibly hard to survive without it. Its functionality has also been slightly changed to be more of an area of effect skill rather than a single target one, affecting multiple enemies and slowing them at once. We're introduced to the Puker Necromorph. This is a new enemy type that will shoot projectile bile at us. If it hits us, it'll slowly damage Isaac, but also slow him. This can be incredibly annoying in battle and can get us swarmed easily. They're also particularly bothersome because it seems like the range on their attacks are very far. We can be hit from so far away. It's bad enough that we don't even see them before getting attacked sometimes. We continue following Dana's route and eventually come upon a residential area of the Titan station. The walls are covered in blood, there's balloons at the reception desk. This is one of the most eerie parts of Dead Space 2, is the variety in environments. Not only does it improve the atmosphere, extending the necromorph invasion to just your average living person, but it also creates a much better swath of levels that we can traverse. This is, of course, compared to the static and industrial halls of the USG Ishimura from the first game. Isaac enters a room and an oxygen tank explodes, causing the vacuum to rip everything out of the room. We have to shoot a lockdown button to prevent us from being ripped into space. We're allowed to use our first store at this point. These also function very similar to the first Dead Space. We can buy ammo, health packs, weapons, suit upgrades, or power nodes from the store. I did notice that credits seem to be given out more conservatively in this entry though. Even with exploring every level as much as I could, it still felt like I didn't have enough credits to comfortably buy upgrades all the time. The suit upgrades that you can purchase will, just like the previous entry, upgrade armor and storage space. But in Dead Space 2, each suit also has unique modifiers as well. The security suit, for example, increases damage done with the pulse rifle by 5%. We get our first vacuum of this entry, a space with no sound or air. Here, again, our senses are deafened, making it difficult to spot enemies in the area. We also have to be conscious of our air to make sure we don't suffocate. In the area after, we encounter the tripod, another new enemy to Dead Space 2. It almost functions like a leaper, jetting at us with high speeds. We have to shoot the pods on its arms to dispense with it. When it's dead, Dana tells us to head to the tram station to get her. She tells Isaac he's been here for 3 years. He was brought to the station by Tiedemann, who found him floating through space. The marker put a self-replicating signal in his head, and it's spreading. He'll die if it isn't stopped. We crawl through another service vent to head to the next area, and this starts Chapter 2. Now, if you remember my video on the first Dead Space, each chapter was pretty formulaic in the way that it started. Isaac would head back to the tram station, take the shuttle to a new area, and begin the next chapter. Dead Space 2 handles this much better. There's really no common thread on when and where chapters begin. It's all a very seamless transition. It can start after we've crawled out of some ducts, been thrown by a powerful necromorph, or ran away from some gunships. This makes the story flow a lot better and is just good pacing overall. This structure really reflects the way that modern games handle chapter separations. We get access to our first bench here, which will allow us to use power nodes found throughout the game or in shops to upgrade our weapons, rig, or stasis module. We can increase anything from air in our suit to reload speed or damage done by throwing objects with kinesis. This is virtually identical to Dead Space 1, except there's an increase in the amount of nodes for each upgradable equipment, and we can also respec for a fee of 5,000 credits. In the next area, we see a video of Tiedemann giving an evacuation order to everyone on the station, one that's looped and was given a while ago. We next enter a residential area of the station, necromorphs swarming the apartments and overrunning the place. We can hear people behind their doors screaming for help. It's a terrifying situation. We see a man impaled by a monster as we ride the elevator up, not able to save him. We see Strauss across the balcony. He says that someone gave them both drugs to erase their memories. We're attacked by a leaper before we can talk to him more. Trying to get into another area, the power goes out, and we're forced to fight waves of necromorphs in the dark. Now, I'm gonna say it. Dead Space 2 is dark. And I don't mean like tonally dark. Well, it kind of is that as well, but it's physically very dark. Much darker than Dead Space 1 by far. There were dark moments in Dead Space for sure, but they were used sparingly. I talked at length about how that game used light as an extra form of communication with the player. A language talking directly to the player's subconscious about whether to be scared or to breathe. Dead Space 2 is mostly dark. Like, a lot of the time, it's either dimly lit or just pitch black. We have to constantly be aiming to see where we're at because we can't see anything without the flashlight. Now, don't get me wrong, this does add some tension and fear into the game. Quite a bit, actually. But like I said, making the decision to not use this sparingly exhausts the usage of the dark as a scare tactic pretty early on. We get to a certain point where it doesn't even matter that we're in the dark because we're used to it. Like a cat. Each time a scare is used in a horror game, it becomes less and less effective. Now, I know what you're going to say, Dad. Dead Space 2 isn't a horror game. It's an action game. And I would be inclined to agree with you. But I don't think the developers did at the time the game was made. Sure, we can find interviews where they say they wanted to bump up the action, but they never said it was shifting genres entirely. Wikipedia lists it as a survival horror game. The Dead Space Wiki lists it as a survival horror game. Steam lists it in the horror and survival horror genres. The back of the box art totes that Dead Space 2 will bring the terror back to space. There was even a famous ad campaign for the game, Your Mom Hates Dead Space 2, that featured moms cringing at the violence and fear that the game presents.
I think it'll make a person become insane.
Because of that, I will be judging Dead Space 2 as a horror game with action elements, and by that sentiment, I suppose I should state my conclusion here. Dead Space 2 is a bad horror game. I'm sure you don't agree, but let me at least take some time across this video and tell you the reasons why. Before we get to that, we need to make our way through the story some more. Isaac weaves his way through the apartments and eventually gets to the other side. Dana tells Isaac that Tideman built another marker, the reason that the necromorphs are overrunning the sprawl. He begins having hallucinations, something Isaac will experience throughout most of the game. We see strange flashing images and noises coming from the screen, and eventually Nicole sitting on a bench. We have to make our way through the train as it rides to its next destination. Of course, defeating many necromorphs along the way. We have to use our boost boots to jet to another car, and eventually the car crashes, ejecting us from the bottom. We're hung by our feet upside down and have to shoot enemies coming at us. Very reminiscent of that famous scene from The Last of Us, even though this was released before The Last of Us. Dana updates our route since we definitely got jetted off of our original one. She's taking us through the Cassini Towers residential center. We enter a section of the station with stores, multiple toy shops, and kid-focused markets. We can hear laughs, the sounds of advertisements, and music boxes. The first half of the game has quite a few of these creepy environments, and it's something that it does pretty well. We're introduced to a new enemy reflective of this specific environment, the Pack. These are very weak necromorphs, gray and small. They resemble children that were infected. They're one of the most terrifying enemies in the sequel. They rush at us, trying to overwhelm rather than inflict damage by themselves. This can happen very easily, but they also die from one hit, so as long as we keep shooting into the horde, we can manage them. After we defeat them, Strauss contacts Isaac. He's paranoid and thinks they're tracking their signals. His memories are coming back. He's seeing symbols. Someone finds him and his video is cut off. We call Dana and she says Strauss was a patient as well, but he's crazy. He killed his wife and kid. We end up at a unitology recruitment center. Dana has routed us through this place so we can get to residential. We eventually reach some sort of maintenance hatch and get our first taste of boosting. Zero-G is much improved in Dead Space 2. No longer are we confined to jumping from wall to wall. We can now float through the air and fly wherever we like. This works much better for puzzle purposes and allows us much more freedom. We fly through a fan and end up in more apartments. This place is covered in unhinged scrawlings covering the walls, the same symbols, language, and marker that we saw on the Ishimura. The interesting thing about these symbols is that it's a real language the team created for Dead Space 1. These are actual writings, and we can translate them because the language was decrypted ages ago. This one, for example, says convergence. This is a really cool touch to their world, causing the bigger fans of the series to delve deeper into the story to find things others wouldn't. Isaac enters a child's room with the shadows from a mobile spinning. He sees Nicole again. She disappears, and Isaac is tracked by a gunship in the sky. Eventually, we arrive at the Unitologist Cathedral. We can find multiple podiums that will give us a backstory on the church and their reverence of a martyr named Michael Altman. Just before entering the main hallway, we're shot at by ships and have to seek refuge inside. The church is probably one of my favorite areas in the game. The environment is so well fleshed out and stylized. Just being in there gives us a better picture of the religion itself, and also the world surrounding Dead Space in general. There's also this inherent fear we have based around grand Gothic buildings like this. Mixing the Gothic architecture with advanced future tech is also just an interesting spin that you don't get to see much. Isaac is contacted by Strauss again, who rambles on about the symbols some more. He says they have to work together, but gets distracted by someone. We find some church indoctrination videos and eventually have to solve a puzzle to get a door open. We almost get sucked out of a window, and if we don't hit the lockdown button, Isaac's arms get severed. We make our way through seeing more apparitions of Nicole speaking to us through the screens. Nicole eventually tries to impale Isaac with a syringe, but as she disappears, he realizes it was him trying to stab himself the whole time. Isaac is at a point where he's lost himself, lost his mind. He barely has control on reality, and these apparitions begin to make us question what is real and what isn't. Because we know what happened in Dead Space 1, we really have no way to trust Isaac as a narrator. It's this setup that makes us just as paranoid as the character that we're playing. We're introduced to the Stalker necromorphs that are almost like small velociraptors. These enemies are quite annoying as well. They'll hide from us until they find an opening and charge. We have to wait patiently for them to come out of cover and try to defeat them as they run at us. Dana tells us to head through the crypt. She tries to tell us something important as well, but her signal is jammed. We head down into the crypt's strange freezer pods are full of bodies, and now those bodies are transformed, breaking out of their glass containers and attacking us. We find the exit, but we have to go straight up. We need to fix the gravity controls, slowing the machine below and pulling arms down to stop it. Isaac heads straight up and finally gets in contact with Dana again. She says that the people in the gunship are probably targeting both of them. We're attacked by another tripod and have to fight off massive waves of the pack. We finally get out of the church and meet with Dana, but she captures Isaac, revealing that she's a unitologist. She says that Isaac was brought here to build markers for them, and he built the one on the sprawl. She won't be curing him because they need him. Just then, a gunship tears apart Dana and her crew. Isaac claws his way into a maintenance hatch and falls down, barely escaping. Before he gets away, the Tormentor shows up, a massive necromorph that rips and tears through everything in its path. We have to shoot its pods as it tries to smash Isaac to bits. This is basically a much upgraded and advanced version of the drag tentacle. We're attacked by the gunship again and thrown out into space. The Tormentor rips apart the gunship and we blow it up, causing Isaac to be thrown into an apartment complex, starting Chapter 6. This is what I mean when chapter transitions are so much smoother. These huge action sequences are actually insanely well done. They're smooth, they're high-paced, fun, and intense. It really ramps up the stakes, and seeing Isaac barely claw his way out of the turmoil he's in is heart-pumping. Strauss contacts us. He wants to team up and destroy the marker. He's recalling something called the Steps, but Isaac doesn't remember these. Strauss is remembering his family again and gets distracted. We have to trust Strauss at this point because we have no other choice. He's our only ally. Our other one, Dana, was a traitor and she's dead. We're introduced to the cysts in the next area. These are small pods that shoot out explosive projectiles. They only shoot out one before dying, so we can easily take care of them by shooting them first. They don't target us, they're only activated when we walk close to them. These are literally the worst enemy in the game. I don't mind the concept overall, something that makes us pause and look around for the gurgling sound to make our way through the hallways, but they're placed in such cheap ways. They'll be put on the ceiling, in front of ammo boxes, or in front of power nodes on the wall, hidden. It's such a cheap way to damage and provide scares for the game. It's also really annoying getting knocked down multiple times in a hallway. They're just used too much, and it gets real old after the first couple of times. This also furthers the point that I'm trying to make. There's a lot of these cheap moments throughout Dead Space 2. The game does feel like it's trying to kill you through combat. It feels like it's working against you, not with you. Through the lens of a horror game, this seems cheap. Through the lens of an action game, not so much. It was at about this time in the game when I realized that I didn't like Dead Space 2 as a horror game. I think it's really a great action game. It does a lot to innovate, and the seamless transitions from area to area, the flowing story, the high intensity, all further that goal. But it feels like a devolution from Dead Space in the horror genre. The game feels like its foot is halfway out the door. They wanted to make an action game, but knew that fans were expecting horror, so they tried to do both. In that, I think they luckily succeeded in making a good action title, but failed at making a good horror. Dead Space 2 is also just a step up in difficulty from the first. Way more enemies are thrown at us. The necromorphs are much faster. Resources are actually in demand in Dead Space 2, seeing us constantly surviving on nothing. It's not that hard in comparison to some more prolific modern titles, but in comparison to the first, it is. When discussing the first game, I talked a lot about balance. Horror is a delicate balance, and everything has to be in place for it to work. This is because you're selling an illusion with horror. If the player can't buy into the illusion that they aren't playing a video game, then it isn't scary. The shocks don't work. The atmosphere can feel more like a haunted house than anything. The first game had a perfect balance, but Dead Space 2 doesn't inherit this from its predecessor. We're constantly thinking about health, ammunition, weapon upgrades, and credits. This is fine normally, and sure, we thought about this stuff in Dead Space as well, but not to this degree. When we're constantly focused on the mechanics because we're dying more than the first game, we've broken the illusion. We've realized that we're playing a video game, and playing a video game isn't inherently scary. Again, don't get me wrong here. Overall, Dead Space 2 is a good game, but it's not a good horror game. The fear that Dead Space presented was a good balance of anxiety and fear. The build-up to the monsters, jump scares were used sparingly. The anticipation was built slowly over the course of the game. The ending culminated in large battles, and when dozens of necromorphs were swarming at you in the final chapter, it felt real. Here, it feels like the action is pumped up to 11 from the very beginning. This leaves very little room for anticipation, suspense, or atmosphere. Just action. Isaac's next path is blocked by fire. We have to get rid of the oxygen in the room to get rid of the flames and make our way forward. We have to transport a battery through the vacuum and eventually get the elevator working. Strauss keeps talking about the steps, something that one of his hallucinations is telling him about. Step 1, he says, is crawling into the dark machine. We face a bunch more stalkers in an open room, and Strauss calls again. He says the steps will destroy the marker. Step 2 is the screws go tight all around. Nothing Strauss says makes sense. He very much fits the bill of what Dana told us, a psycho who we shouldn't trust. But it doesn't really matter. We have to at least use him for a little bit until we can find someone else. Just then we see a woman shooting necromorphs fighting for her life. She doesn't trust Isaac and doesn't want to work together. She says her name is Ellie. Isaac offers to help, but she heads in the elevator and tells him not to follow. We're introduced to another type of necromorph, almost as terrifying as the pack: crawlers. These are childlike necromorphs, crab walking on their hands and feet with huge pods on their stomach. Shooting their pods will kill them, but they explode on death, so we have to be distanced when we do it. Nicole shows up again, asking Isaac if he's in denial. Isaac thinks he's better than Strauss. He knows these are hallucinations, but Nicole tells him that his pain won't go away even if he destroys the marker. One of the biggest disappointments in the game was the fact that the carousel in this room wouldn't spin when I used kinesis. Ellie has met Strauss, and she's weary of him, but Isaac tells her to work with him. She offers to take him to the hub. We reunite with the two who are upstairs. The power goes out and Tideman contacts Isaac. He shut down the train and life support. He says they can't recover the place, so he can't allow anyone to escape, including Ellie and Isaac. We're attacked by a brute who mostly functions the same as the first game. They're a little different, though, in that they have pods on their shoulders that we have to destroy. No more stasis and attacking the back. When we defeat it, Isaac tells Ellie what their goal is: to destroy the marker. She's forced to help because they need to get the life support systems online or they're all dead. We have to fix the solar arrays to get the power back online. Before we get further into the story, I'd like to talk about how the weapons have changed in Dead Space 2. There's a lot of similarities from the previous game. We have a wealth of weapons to choose from as long as we have the credits to buy them. We can equip 4 at once, and there's a lot of repeats from the previous entry. We still have the plasma cutter, obviously, the line gun, the plasma rifle, and the Ripper that we talked about in the last video. I decided not to stress myself out in this entry though, and avoided the Ripper at all costs, learning my lesson. I did use the plasma cutter, plasma rifle, and the line gun quite a bit. They're all really good and function basically the same as before. My 4th weapon was a bit more variable throughout my playthrough of Dead Space 2 though, because I couldn't find anything that worked great in that spot. I used the Seeker rifle quite a bit, which is more of a long-range, one-shot weapon that can do a bunch of damage as long as you're accurate. I also used the detonator, which allows you to plant mines around an area, and enemies explode when they're tripped. Both were pretty good and had a lot of functionality, but when I was in a tight situation, I felt like I needed something better. There's also the flamethrower, which I used a lot during the DLC, which we'll be talking about at the end of the video. The flamethrower does a pretty decent amount of damage, and is actually good in a pinch. The weapon variety is just as good as the previous game. We have a lot of weapons to choose from, each that feels like it's made for a particular group of enemies or situations. One nitpick that I really didn't like was the static reticle. In Dead Space, the aiming for the weapons was actually a light that was cast on wherever you were aiming. You could see how the light was overlaid on the enemy you were aiming at. Here, the reticle is just circles that are stuck on the screen. I really liked the dynamic reticle from before. It actually felt a lot more in-world, which I think was a much larger focus in the first game than this one. I know it's a small thing to be talking about, but it really bummed me out to see it changed. Isaac has to repair an elevator using a thrust canister. These are small pods that we can place on equipment, and shooting the bottom of them will cause them to propel the object forward. This is a puzzle mechanic, not just an item that we can use wherever, which would be cool. Strauss is giving Ellie issues because he won't stop mumbling. We go through a ridiculously intense sequence with multiple large enemies trying to crawl into the elevator as it's propelled upwards. We have to fend them off until we reach our destination. We reach the array station, but it's locked out for someone named Howard Phillips. If we read the text log in the next room over, we can find out that he lived here. His body is actually still here, and we can use it to get into the door. I loved this little puzzle. I thought it was such a genius idea. The game doesn't really tell us we need to do this either. It's not insanely hard to figure out, but it was one of those situations where, when I was trying it, I didn't think it was actually going to work, and then it did. There's a bunch of text logs that we can find to actually learn more about Howard's time on the station and his love of birds. We have to make it through the array system. Part of that is solving a fuse box puzzle. We have to crawl through vents to 2 separate rooms and arrange the fuses in the correct order. This is mostly randomly placing fuses until they're lit up green. I suppose I should quickly talk about the Peng Easter egg in Dead Space because it'll definitely come up again. This is a running joke throughout the Dead Space games. I didn't talk about it in my previous video, but towards the end of the game, we can find a hidden statue that we can kinesis pull towards us and pick up. This is the Peng treasure and can be sold for a ton of credits at the store. In Dead Space 2, this returns. In this fuse room, we can arrange the fuses so that they are lit up blue, which will allow us to move the maintenance shaft and crawl to an extra room. In here, we find a bunch of power nodes and another Peng statue. It's not really clear exactly what Peng is. There's posters for it throughout the games as if it's some sort of product, but I couldn't find any definitive answer. It's probably just an in-joke at the studio and is left purposefully ambiguous. Because it's in every game, though, I thought it was worth noting here. Correctly placing the fuses allows us to find the mainframe circuits, which we have to destroy. Now the solar arrays need realigned, but Strauss is freaking out, screaming that he isn't ready for the needle again. We see Nicole again, asking Isaac how he holds everything inside. We head out into space and have to take control of the solar arrays, aligning them with each other to get the power back online. We have to fight a nest necromorph. These will always bother us when we're in 0G. They shoot seeking projectiles at us that do a pretty good bit of damage, and the only way to kill them is to destroy their pods. We align the panels and the beam almost hits Ellie and Strauss. The necromorphs are making their way to the transport hub. Isaac and the crew have to get there before the monsters do, or their transportation will be destroyed. Isaac uses an escape pod to hurtle himself through the sky, down into the sprawl. We have to bob and weave through space debris, and eventually Isaac makes a messy landing. Ellie and Strauss are upstairs, but the place begins to explode. We have to run while Ellie and Strauss take refuge in the factory. Ellie laments the fact that she was in the same place this morning with her crew. She was a CEC officer working for the same company that Isaac once did. She feels like they're making no progress, but Isaac focuses on the task at hand. They have to regroup. She gives us a route to the central hub. We eventually find the two of them separated by glass. The door's jammed, of course. We have to make our way through the processing plant to meet up with them. We have an awesome sequence where we have to float through 0G and use thrusters to open doors. We have to avoid all kinds of machinery threatening to slice us in half. Tideman finds our location, trying to kill us again by activating the equipment we have to get around. When talking to Ellie, we hear Strauss telling her she has to follow the steps before the both of them are attacked by necromorphs. We eventually get through the tunnels, and we see a transmission of Strauss hounding Ellie about Step 3. We finally meet up with Ellie and Strauss in person. Strauss won't stop talking about the 4 steps, but he won't tell us what Step 4 is. We have to get to the industrial transport so we can make it to the government center. We have to physically deploy the tram, and Nicole confronts Isaac again.
Why'd you come looking for me if you knew I was dead, Isaac? Did you think I would forgive you?
Get out of my head. You're not Nicole!
Ellie and Strauss arrive, and the 3 of them take the tram out. On the ride, Isaac sees the Ishimura. Ellie tells him that everyone on board died because of a terrorist attack, but Isaac tells her what really happened on the ship. Something blocks the track, and we have to get off the tram. We find a huge mass blocking it. There's large pods of nitrogen chloride, which we can overheat by tossing red flammable canisters at them. We have to set the one at the bottom off, but we're swarmed by enemies. This is kind of an intense moment because we have to dodge and get away from the enemies while also blowing up the tank. The entire place explodes, but we make it onto the tram just in time. Tideman contacts Isaac again. He's going to use the solar beam to attack them. He cuts the tracks off, and the only way to get across is to use the gravity tethers from the Ishimura. We're forced to go back through the ship. Seeing all these old areas covered in white plastic, ladders littering the hallways is odd. Walking through the hallways, we constantly feel like we're going to be assailed by enemies at any given moment, but for quite a while, we aren't. There's a lot of time to build up tension here, and it's honestly one of my favorite parts of the game. But eventually this is undercut when we walk down a large pathway and the waves start coming. We fight off tons of powerful necromorphs, and the intensity doesn't stop from there. I guess my real problem with Dead Space 2 as a horror game is its level of intensity. A horror game needs real, genuine time to build its atmosphere. Not only that, but it needs time for the player to anticipate the horror that's to come. If there's no anticipation, then the horror that's arrived is defunct. It means nothing because it's just another enemy on the screen. My main problem with Dead Space 2 is that it gives no time for the player to anticipate the horror. Horror works best when the intensity is slowly increased and decreased over time, causing the player to feel true anxiety in the most intensive situations. When your level of intensity and combat is bumped up to 11 from the very start, there's no going back. The seal has been broken. You can't return to try and build the atmosphere up again. And this is all because of the elephant in the room, that Dead Space 2 is truly an action game. The developers sold it as a horror, and maybe they wanted to make a horror game, but they ended up making an action game because they thought it would improve sales, which the first game didn't have. And as an action game, Dead Space does work. It's incredibly intense, the pace is high, the storytelling is fantastic and fluid, but it just doesn't work in the context of horror, especially when we look at its predecessor. We fight down a long hallway of enemies and eventually arrive back in the very familiar halls of the Ishimura, returning to many of the familiar places that we visited in the first game. We even come back through the decontamination chamber from the first entry, and in the biggest troll ever, as we're waiting for monsters to pop out of the vents, a repeat of last time, nothing happens. It's a fantastic subversion of expectations, and genuinely makes us worry for quite a while, waiting for the impending doom. We're attacked by tons of enemies and have to fix the centrifuge that we did last time, only now we have to place circuit boards on top of the thing. In comparison, it's a much better puzzle, and I can really only view this as Dead Space 2 flexing its upgraded puzzle mechanics for this new entry. There's an interesting bit where we get attacked by the drag tentacle from the first game, but it turns out to be a vision. This brings into question what Isaac is imagining because of the marker, and what is actually PTSD because of his time on the Ishimura. The whole hallucination thing in general could just be a metaphor for PTSD overall. When we head back through the decontamination chamber, we are attacked, and we have to backtrack to make our escape. Ellie is getting worried by Strauss because he keeps talking to his kid who isn't alive. He attacks her with a screwdriver and we're cut off from their comms. We take the tram and Ellie says that Strauss bit her. The tram is stopped because of an obstruction ahead. In the room where we first met the hunter in Dead Space 1, we see the video of Nicole that was heavily featured in the first game. We eventually get the rail lined back up and alert Ellie. After we get the gravity tethers online, Ellie gets the tram going, and Tideman chides us for it. We head into an escape pod, but Nicole's apparition tries to stop us. Ellie contacts us again, and Strauss attacks her with a screwdriver again. The escape pod crashes, and we see strange visions of Nicole in front of the red marker. As we wake up, Strauss is holding a screwdriver to Ellie's eye. When we head through the facility we crashed into, Strauss tells us he showed Ellie step 3. He says they're afraid of him because he was going to destroy the marker. We head through a mining facility and Strauss shows that he's cut Ellie's eye out, but she attacks him and we're cut off the two as they fight. Isaac is whipped out into space by some creature, and Ellie says that Strauss has escaped into the mines. We're in the vacuum of space and have to get 2 intersecting lasers out of the way. We have to use the thrusters to move the lasers out of the doorway. When we get inside, Ellie says she has something Isaac will want to see, and on top of that, Strauss is after him. Strauss attacks us in the mines and we have to stab him in the head. Shortly after, Nicole attacks us. Step 4 is acceptance. We reunite with Ellie. She found a massive drill that will get us through to the other side. Isaac says that Strauss was running away from his guilt, but Isaac isn't running anymore, seemingly overcoming his feelings about Nicole. We repair the drill and use it to head out, but we get swarmed on top by dozens of necromorphs. Eventually, Ellie crashes the thing and we're ejected. Ellie thinks that the marker is close, in the government sector. We make our way to Ellie and she boards a ship, but Isaac locks her in it, telling her to get out and save herself.
Are you ready to talk now?
Why? So I can let you go too? I can't do that, Nicole. I never wanted to let you go.
A lot happened that we never wanted. Isaac. Touch me.
I don't think that's a good idea.
Isaac, please. Make us whole.
Nicole wants to be whole again, but we head down to destroy the marker. Tideman has 200 men waiting for us, ready to shoot Isaac down. He's not lying either, because as we enter the next area, his men shoot at us, causing us to have to run into a side passage. We turn off the power and his men are fed to the necromorphs. Nicole begins to help us at this point. She wants to show us the way to the marker. Since we've come to terms with our guilt, she's assisting us. Nicole says that we'll know what to do when the time comes. We finally see the marker. The convergence is at hand. Thousands of necromorphs are swarming at the artifact. Tideman says that he spent years looking through Isaac's head. They were supposed to understand the marker. The artifact begins to activate. They didn't expect this many bodies, though, and Nicole takes us away to make us whole again. She leads us to a machine that will remove the marker codes from our head. These were the steps that Strauss was telling us about. We have an absolutely insane sequence where we have to plunge a needle into Isaac's eye. Nicole disappears and tells Isaac to follow the light, to head to the marker. Just then, the Ubermorph shows up. This is the successor to the Hunter from Dead Space. It can't be killed, just dismembered before regenerating and slowed down with stasis. We have to stun it and hack the panel to get out of the room. We run through the halls, stopping the Ubermorph wherever we can, and have to navigate some fiery zero-G. Nicole tells us to let go, and we enter the final stretch of the game. The Ubermorph is chasing us all the way, and we have to run from tons and tons of different necromorphs. We eventually find the light, but Tideman shoots Isaac with 2 javelins. Isaac disarms him and ends Tideman. Nicole takes Isaac into her arms. She tells him, it's time to die. And suddenly we're transported somewhere else. The makers of the marker need to be absorbed. Isaac is the last body they need for the convergence. This is our final boss battle. Nicole was tricking us yet again. Here we have to shoot this shade that looks like Nicole. Shooting her enough will open up the marker and we can damage it. All the while, tons of shades that look like the pack are rushing at us, trying to kill us. Doing enough damage to the core will eventually destroy the marker. Isaac is back to normal, but the sector is collapsing around him. He sits down and accepts his fate, until Ellie calls him. She's coming back to save him. We have to fly up to the ship. The two narrowly escape, and we get a scene very similar to Dead Space's ending. But when Isaac looks over, it's just Ellie, showing that the marker codes are gone from his brain. Not only that, but he's gotten past his guilt. He's left those things in the past, and he's moved on. After the credits, we hear an audio conversation from the Overseer. He's being informed of the destruction of Marker Site 12. He says the other sites will have to pick up the pieces, telling us that there are many more markers out there than we think. Before we talk about my final thoughts on Dead Space 2, I'd like to quickly talk about the Severed DLC. This was a very short piece of downloadable content that was released on March 1st, 2011. It was only available for the console versions of the games. The DLC runs parallel to Isaac's story, though only the beginning of it. It actually surrounds a character that showed up in an earlier spin-off game called Dead Space Extraction, which we'll be talking about in the full retrospective. The man's name is Gabe Weller and is the protagonist of this expansion. Weller was on a patrol in the Titan mines when the outbreak happened. His squad was wiped out and now he's searching for his girlfriend, Maxine. He gets orders from Tideman to scrub the facilities and is eventually betrayed by his superior officer, Victor Bartlett. Victor was ordered to kill Gabe's girlfriend, and he has to take out Gabe because he knows he'll never let it stand. The reason for her being targeted is that she was involved in something called the Oracle Project. Apparently they were studying Lexine because she seemed to be immune to the outbreak in some way. Gabe and Lexine were both on Aegis 7 and were some of the only survivors. Gabe eventually tracks down his wife, who's being carried away by two men in white lab coats. Lexine makes her escape onto a ship, and the two men are killed. Gabe tries to board the ship with her, hacking the panel to unlock an airlock, but Victor shows back up and uses a grenade to destroy them both. Gabe's leg is severed, and he uses his last moments to save Lexine, defending himself long enough to open the airlock for her. We see that Gabe's body was collected for study, and Lexine is still on the run. This short DLC was actually pretty good. It's much more action-heavy than Dead Space 2, especially because it's so short in length. It's forced to put the pressure on right away because the whole thing is only about an hour and a half long. The story itself, though, was kind of shocking. I was genuinely surprised to see that the main character just died at the end. It was something I wasn't really expecting. The DLC did have a fair amount of bugs, though, especially the end scene where, after the credits, I just got stuck in the main room with no enemies or interactables. Overall, like I've said plenty of times now, I don't think Dead Space 2 works as a horror game. It's a fantastic action game, though. It's very well paced, the intensity is high throughout the entire game, we're always fighting off hordes of enemies, getting attacked by huge beasts, and flying through the air. Its constant and relentless pace makes us feel like we're always being chased, always being hunted. The new seamless transitions into chapters make the game and its story feel much smoother, rather than disconnected levels that we have to travel to. Speaking of the story, it's also greatly improved in this entry. Its themes of PTSD, guilt, and grief are very well done. This specter of Nicole that haunts us throughout the game is both terrifying as a real monster in the world, but also as a representation of Isaac's inability to let go of what once was. In the end, I don't really think Dead Space 2 was for me. I want to be honest with how I feel about this game. I know a lot of people enjoyed this entry, but I was expecting something completely different. I wanted more of what we got in Dead Space. I'm aware that a lot of the things that came from the first entry do reappear in the second. The innovations on the horror formula are mostly still there, but having the same ingredients doesn't mean that you're going to get the same result. There are many other variables that go into baking a cookie. The atmosphere just wasn't there for me this time around, and it really felt like the balance was off. I say this again just to reiterate, Dead Space 2 is a good game. I just don't think it succeeds as a horror. I do want to give Dead Space 2 some genuine credit, though. There are a lot of things it does that I think greatly influenced action games for years, even to this day. You can see in the large interactive action sequences where modern action games have pulled from Dead Space 2 with regards to inspiration. There's a ton going on here, and Dead Space 2 would persist for quite a while. It has a really strong legacy that it's affected gaming for the better. It's not the first game to have done these things, but it's one of the ones that really pushed it up and made audiences see the full breadth of what these cinematic sequences could do for games. Dead Space 2 really is a much more cinematic version of the first game. It's not that the plot is easier to follow, it's just meatier than the first game. Dead Space was a little lacking in its actual story. It was mostly a tale about Isaac running around the ship and trying to save the Ishimura before eventually finding out about the marker. Dead Space 2 gets the reward of dealing with Isaac as a character more, since he can actually speak. There are a lot of small changes, quality of life ones, that really increase the overall feel. Being able to see our ammunition when switching weapons, being able to do more than one melee attack in a row without a huge delay in between animations. There's a lot here that Dead Space 2 improves on, but judging it as a horror game, it doesn't carry that same punch. As we said before, EA had spent a ton of money on marketing for Dead Space 2. They really wanted it to be a success, more than the previous entry was, because if you remember, they considered that one a disappointment. The critical reviews were, again, great. It carries a 90 out of 100 on Metacritic for the Xbox 360 version of the game. Reviewers loved the improved protagonist, the increased cinematic elements to the game, and the sound design. The marketing also seemed to have paid off because Dead Space 2 shipped 2 million units in its first week of release. It was selling at a ratio of 2-to-1 when compared to the first game. It was the third best-selling game of the month in January, just behind Black Ops 2 and Just Dance. But this didn't last long, and the production budget was so much higher for the second game that combined with the marketing budget, the game was still a commercial failure. Despite all that, EA decided to move forward with a third game in the franchise. It would be the final one in the mainline series. But we'll talk about that next time. Bye, Dad.